One of the most rewarding aspects of working in the field is to be able to go and make a positive impact on the lives of cancer patients.
Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Today we're joined by Dr. Harch, Vice President of Manufacturing and Chemistry at IsoBio, focusing on developing novel targeted radioligand therapies.
Harch is a CMC leader with 17 years specialising in ADC manufacturing and external partnerships. In this episode, we unpack the evolving ADC landscape, discuss CDMO strategy, and explore the operational levers that drive success from early development through commercial launch. Thanks for joining me, Harch.
Thank you for having me, Dora. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's start with your journey then. Can you take us back to the beginning? What first drew you to this incredibly complex modality, and how has the ADC landscape evolved since you first entered the field?
I'll be honest that I sort of fell into this field. This was a little bit by luck. I was contacted by a recruiter that was looking to fill a position on what was then Seattle Genetics. They had some very exciting data for an antibody drug conjugate they had in the clinic called SGN-35. And so this is what ultimately became Adcetris. And so they were looking to bolster their CMC team. And so I took that opportunity to join. As far as how things have evolved in the field, there's, ADCs, when we joined, there'd been one approved ADC, Mylotarg, that Pfizer had got approval in the early 2000s. But it was still a very novel field, one that people were wondering, would it actually work? And they were wondering, perhaps it would work for liquid tumors, so lymphomas in particular, for example, but perhaps it wouldn't work for solid tumors. But what we've seen with over time is that the field has been incredibly successful. There have been no shortage of setbacks, but I think through those setbacks as well, there's been opportunities to learn, and we're seeing now an incredible amount of interest in antibody drug conjugates.
Really interesting. So you mentioned the evolution of ADCT drugs. So Mylotarg, the first approved ADC, which obviously faced significant safety concerns and sort of regulatory setbacks following its launch in 2000. Now there's, correct me if I'm wrong, 15 approved ADCs today, with Enhertu being a real game changer for certain types of breast cancer, for example. So from your experience, what's driving this acceleration then, and what makes ADC manufacturing fundamentally more complex than traditional biologics or small molecules?
So I think what's driving the interest in ADCs is that they've been proven to be an effective modality to help with treating cancer. So, and cancer is a very complex disease. Really, every specific cancer type is unique. But what ADCs help to do is allow targeting of a very potent chemotherapeutic agent against the cancer cells more selectively. And so really what you're trying to then do is help the patients a lot more by not exposing them to the general toxicity with traditional chemotherapy and providing very effective targeted agents. As far as then what makes manufacturing so complex, ADCs consist of an antibody that's connected to a cytotoxic payload via a linker. And like the concept of a selective delivery of a targeted agent to cancer cells is a very simple one, but it's proven very difficult to actually bring to bear. And so there's been a lot that's been learned through trial and error, both in the research field initially, and then as things progress through the preclinical and clinical stages. And as I mentioned before, the failures have actually helped educate and move the field forward. But the complexity then is there's an antibody component. So often people have antibody manufacturing experience. That's one thing. The linker-payloads or drug linkers have a highly potent toxic agent that needs high containment in order to safely manufacture those components. And then linking a biologic with a highly potent small molecule, again, you need to worry about worker safety is inherently challenging. And the fill finish has that same aspect of managing the potent nature of the compounds.
Yeah, really interesting. You can definitely see how complicated it is just because you've got all the different components. Does that impact how you sort of approach outsourcing then?
So especially in the early days, there were people there were CDMOs that had expertise in antibody manufacturing, a handful that had expertise in highly potent compound manufacturing, and they learned how to make drug linkers. Initially, there were very few that actually knew how to do conjugation. And so that's something that I think they learnt, the CDMOs learnt along with the innovative companies on how to do that, how to execute that, and how to scale it up successfully. And then the fill finish again was That maybe was a little bit less complicated in that you need a CDMO that has experience in sterile fill finish, but the additional complexity of then adding in a highly potent component makes that a little bit more challenging overall.
Interesting. Thanks for that. And so you've worked with CDMOs across the US, Europe, China, and India. How does the global ADC manufacturing landscape differ by region? Are there particular strengths or specializations you've seen in different geographies?
So historically, interestingly as well, a lot of the CDMOs that were embracing working in the ADC space were in Europe initially. There were some in the US as well, but a lot more were concentrated in Europe. But as interest in the field has grown, then you were seeing CDMOs come into play, especially in China, but also in India.
Interesting. Thanks for that. And one of the biggest challenges our listeners face is selecting the right CDMO partners for ADC work. Given the 4 distinct manufacturing activities you mentioned, antibody production, linker payload, conjugation, and fill finish, how do you recommend companies approach CDMO benchmarking and selection? What are the sort of non-negotiable criteria?
I think it really is it's a valuation that's done on a case by case basis. And so for each innovative company, they need to determine for themselves, what are the most important criteria to focus on? Where do they have internal expertise already that they might be able to leverage, or do they need to outsource everything? I certainly recommend making sure that any CDMOs, they select the linker payload with the conjugation, with the fill finish, have appropriate health and safety approaches in place, because that's where the potent compounds are. One thing to consider I think, is now proving to be value added, are CDMOs that can do multiple steps of manufacturing without having to move the material across borders, because shipping is surprisingly challenging for these types of molecules. Almost always there's cold chain involved, but just working through the logistics, the customs, importation, exportation, all of those things can sometimes add unexpected delays to the manufacturing process. So there are a lot of people will offer a one-stop shop, but I would encourage innovative companies that are thinking about this to go and ask specifically where are each of the components manufactured? Are they manufactured on the same site, which is ideal? If they have to be transported, how far are they going to be transported? If they start to cross country borders, then I encourage people to ask more questions again there.
Makes sense. Thanks a lot for that. And so safety is another consideration that's paramount, especially when handling highly potent compounds with OELs of between 1 and 100 nanograms per cubic meter. So during your site visits and CDMO evaluations, what specific safety and containment capabilities would you look for? Are there any kind of red flags that would make you walk away from a potential partner?
I think maybe the first thing to do before a site visit is to ask questions about how they approach handling potent compounds. Ask if they do surrogate testing, and then a lot of people will talk about they can handle band 4 compounds, band 5 compounds, band 3B compounds. One thing that I think it's important for people to understand is that, for the most part, each company will set its own banding system. So it's important to understand really how the bands correlate to the occupational exposure levels, and then tie those to, and then evaluate the compounds that you're working with. Can they be handled safely from just that initial standpoint? Beyond that, so after just asking some basic questions on how they approach safety, I think it really is important to go on site, understand what level of training they do. It's look at the infrastructure, and also understand how they've come to those numbers. Like, is it through would be an ideal case scenario is where they've trained their employees well, and they've done surrogate testing with monitoring, not only around the containment that they're working on, but also where there is testing attached to the employees. And so you can get close to the breathing zone, so you can get a sense of how good is the containment, but also how good are the operator skills to be able to handle these potent compounds.
Definitely. And when you mentioned bands, band 3, band 4, what do you mean by that? How are they categorized?
So usually compounds that people will talk about hazard compound handling in terms of, we have a 4-band system. So the first band is usually not a very potent compound. Band 2 will be slightly more potent. Band 3, they'll start to consider potent. Band 4 will be highly potent. But some people might have a 6-band, a 7-band system, a 5-band system. And so they then have, typically they'll have OELs tied to each of those different bands. But in addition to that, they'll have handling practices tied to those different bands. And they might say, for example, that they can a company has done testing and shown that they can handle up to a band 5, but not a band 6. And that might take them to 10 nanograms per cubic meter, but they won't go to 1 nanogram per cubic meter, for example.
I see. Great. Thanks for that. And so I know you've mentioned previously that unexpected events such as unanticipated toxicity or changes in the competitive landscape might require reprioritization of programs. How do you build flexibility into your external manufacturing strategies? What contractual or operational mechanisms have you found most effective for maintaining agility?
So that's a challenging one because the CDMO partners typically will go and block, manufacturing slots, support your programs. And so when there are priorities that change internally or from external sources, I think one of the key things is being as open and transparent with the CDMOs as possible, making them aware of things, the landscape as it does change, and trying to work with them to see what could be done. Is there another client perhaps that is keen to get into the space that is ready and able to take an earlier slot, and you can switch out with them? Isn't always possible. The CDMOs do run a busy schedule and the margins aren't always all that high. So but communication, I think, is key to try to manage flexibility externally.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. And so let's talk about tech transfers then. In your experience managing multiple technology transfers with multiple CDMOs, what are the most common stumbling blocks you see that companies encounter? And how can sponsors better prepare for successful tech transfers, particularly, given the complexity of ADC processes?
Maybe starting off, one of the things that is often underestimated to just get going with the tech transfer is actually putting the contract in place. So it's always like the RFPs go out, the proposals come back, there's technical discussions between the teams, there's usually a lot of enthusiasm for the kickoff to occur as soon as possible. But sometimes there are contractual terms that need to be squared away. And that can, people sometimes underestimate how much work how much time and energy that takes. But it is very important to get the legal framework in place. What you can try to do, there are a couple of different strategies there. You can try to go and work on a master services agreement. And then as you have new work coming into the CMO and you have work orders or scopes of work, people call them different things. But then most of the hard work with negotiating the contract is already in place with that master services agreement. If one's not in place and you want to go quickly, you can try to see if your company and the CDMO is open to having an LOA, letter of agreement, to start the work off with the understanding that, the negotiations for the MSA are still ongoing. Beyond just the contractual things, lead times for raw materials, it's important to take those things into account. As a lot of people focus a lot on the process, the actual manufacturing process itself. But another area that is often underestimated is getting the analytical methods in place to support the process. Because unless you can evaluate how the process is going, you're sort of really in the dark there. And often you do want to have specific methods for each step to be able to understand the in-process controls, the purity of the intermediates at the end, and so on and so forth. And so making sure those analytical methods established as quickly as possible is very important, but is often one of the rate limiting steps in a tech transfer.
Yeah, great. Interesting. And so how do you approach the make versus buy decision across different steps of ADC manufacturing? If a biotech CEO asks you tomorrow, Harch, we're developing our first ADC, which manufacturing steps should we absolutely keep in-house and which should we outsource first? What would you say?
I guess the first question would be, what capabilities do you have in-house already for manufacturing? If the biotech has some capabilities in-house already, I think it makes sense to evaluate, can those be done safely in-house? The one that is most commonly and I think most safely handled in-house is antibody manufacturing. And so if they have that, then I would encourage them to look into that for sure. But all the other steps, much more challenging to bring in-house. So drug linker manufacturing, as I mentioned, is you're dealing with highly potent compounds. Typically, you would need a chromatographic purification system, so you're dealing with a large amount of liquid waste. In addition to that, sometimes you need lyophilization capabilities. You're handling then a very fine, dry powder of a highly potent compound that you need really, really strong containment around. So that drug linker manufacturing is a challenge. Conjugation has the same initial challenges with the highly potent drug linker until you get into solution. Once it's in solution, typically it's a lot safer to handle. So that's another one that and people can handle this through either fixed isolators or disposable isolators. But if you go and use those for the dissolution, and then you have capabilities in antibody manufacturing, you can often utilize a lot of the similar skill sets to go and successfully deploy for conjugation. Fill finish is typically something that requires a lot of capital investment. So it is a very capital heavy activity, but it's not one that I would start off with for that reason.
I see. Interesting. And so you mentioned that you see companies mostly will have the antibody services in-house already. Why is that? Is that because, as you said, it's the least complex part of manufacturing, or might it be that they already have the in-house capabilities because you see kind of trends in what sort of companies are moving into the ADC landscape?
Yeah, so I think if they have antibody manufacturing in-house, it probably means they already have an antibody pipeline that is relatively mature. And so really that's the starting point. And of course you need the antibodies. It's one of the key components of an antibody drug conjugate. So it's sort of an expansion of the portfolio. And antibodies themselves can be, very, very effective modalities for treating human disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know you've noted that pairing manufacturing activities like antibody production with conjugation or conjugation with fill finish can be advantageous. How do you evaluate these integrated kind of systems, and what sort of questions should companies ask when considering these sorts of partnerships?
So I think one of the key things to ask is about whereabouts geographically and physically are these operations conducted? Are they conducted on the same site or in the same country? I think those are two important considerations because it minimizes logistical challenges as well as export. And it does provide more flexibility with regards to if there's a little bit of delay in an upstream process that the manufacturing is being done on site, perhaps there can be ways to expedite the release and not have to worry about shipping in order to keep the downstream activities still on track. Or vice versa, another iteration of that. If there is a delay in the start of the downstream, can there be? But it's all done in-house. There's certainly an interest in trying to make things as efficient as possible, hold the timelines. Can the final material that's being made can the release of that be expedited?
Interesting. You've mentioned quite a bit about supply chain and like logistics issues and making sure you're prepared for challenges. And I know that the supply chain has been disturbed in the kind of the past few years, or there have been lots of challenges. Is that something you're particularly aware of in the last few years about these kind of supply chain issues and preparing for any challenges that might be thrown your way?
Dora, I think one of the things that I've been surprised about, I don't know that this has necessarily been something that's, I think it's always been there. And I think one of the things I've been surprised about is I've always thought that any individual component of the ADC is difficult to manufacture. But sometimes it seems that getting whether it's the antibody to the conjugation site, the drug linker to the conjugation site, or the conjugate itself to the fill finish site can be more complicated than any of the individual manufacturing steps, which it seems a little bit counterintuitive given the complexity of the modalities that we're actually making. But it's when I talk to other colleagues across the industry, it sounds like this is more common and maybe not as necessarily as talked about as might be otherwise obvious. So I don't know that it's necessarily a new thing. I think additional challenges probably making it more complex now still, but overall, I think it's always been a under discussed and challenging aspect of multi-location manufacturing.
Yeah, interesting. Looking ahead then, with hundreds of ADCs now in clinical trials, what changes do you anticipate in the ADC manufacturing sort of ecosystem? Are there emerging technologies, regulatory shifts, or market dynamics that companies should be preparing for?
So geopolitically, there's a lot of moving parts right now. So it's very hard to predict how things will settle. We are certainly seeing a movement of a lot of organizations trying to de-risk by establishing manufacturing facilities in the US. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve. As I mentioned, there have been some players in the US, but not a whole lot. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Overall, though, I'm very excited about the field. It's becoming a lot more mature, there's a lot more interest. some of the challenges from just a technology, a pure scientific standpoint that were encountered earlier in the ADC field. People are recognizing them and making active efforts to look to address them, whether it's uh, the potency, the loading, the stability of the ADCs in circulation, how to handle off-target toxicity or on-target toxicity even. So all of these things are, I think, people are making strides towards. And I look forward to sort of seeing how the field continues to evolve and hopefully then the benefit that it can continue to bring to cancer patients.
Interesting. Do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd want our listeners to hear?
Just reinforce again how exciting the ADC field is. And really, it's one of the most rewarding aspects of working in the field is to be able to go and make a positive impact on the lives of cancer patients, which is the disease that, broadly affects pretty much everyone. Well, we if not ourselves, then we know someone who's been affected by cancer. So it's great to be able to make contributions into this field.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, Harch. It's been great to talk to you today. Thanks a lot for your time.